Okay, everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce Andrew Sepielli. He's a associate professor of philosophy here, and he's written some very important work, like foundational work on moral uncertainty, and then he wrote this great book, Pragmatics, Quietism, which is a great book. I should confess that I thought when the book was coming out, it's great because pragmatism says way too much. Quietism says way too little, too little. That'll be a combination. But then it's an adjective, so it doesn't quite work. Okay, but yeah, I'm looking forward to the talk.
All right, great, thanks, Sergio. All right, thank you all for coming and holding space for this talk. All right, yeah, I mean the some talks here at the Center for Ethics are like on major pressing issues of the day, but this is not like this. Like, it's a very abstruse talk. And it's also at a very early stage of development. So if anybody's watching from any funding agencies or whatever, like usually it's, I don't know, better than this. So maybe I'll start by just kind of telling people like why I'm interested in this polarism, which I'll get to in just a second. So actually, if people could flip to page 6, like the very last page, I'll kind of talk you into my thinking about this. So raise your hand here if you've ever come across Jonathan Bennett's argument for the moral insignificance or irrelevance of the distinction between doing and allowing. Couple, lot of hands, good. So they come out great. So for those of you who have not come across this distinction, I basically think like Bennett's argument, it has some, things to be ironed out, but it's basically this sort of zenith of like moral philosophy. This is like what I think moral philosophy should be. So I'll just kind of explain what the argument is and how this brings me to polarism. So, philosophers have all these debates about whether, it matters whether you do a harm or whether you merely allow a harm to happen. And a lot of times, if you're familiar with contemporary moral philosophies, people like toss around these examples and like, one person's like, oh, but you can't capture this like, counterexample about super tasking. But Bennett's not playing that kind of game. So what Bennett does is tries to offer this analysis of the concepts of doing harm and allowing harm. If you want to put it this way, he tries to like sort of look under the hood or see kind of what doing and allowing harm fundamentally come down to. And once we've got that, he thinks, I think, sort of privileged vantage point, then he thinks that we can see that there's no moral significance to the distinction between doing and allowing harm. So here's what he says. He says, here's the difference between doing and allowing harm. In both cases, whether you're doing harm or you're allowing a harm to happen, you comport yourself in some way. A harm occurs, and that harm counterfactually depends. I'm going to stand up. Counterfactually depends on the way you comport yourself. There are other ways in which you could have comported yourself such that the harm wouldn't have happened when and how it did. The difference is when you do harm, very few of the other ways of comporting yourself are such that the harm would happen when and how it did. But when you allow a harm to happen, most of the ways of comporting yourself are such that the harm would have happened when and how it did. So think of the difference between, shooting somebody and allowing somebody to drown, right? You shoot somebody, most of the other ways you could have moved your body are such that the harm would not have happened, right? But when you allow somebody to drown, most of the ways in which you could have moved your body are such that they would have drowned. If you dance, they drown. If you, clap your hands, they drown. If you swim in the other direction, whatever, they drown, right? So that's Bennett's analysis of this distinction between doing and allowing harm. But then here's the argument. He says, look, there's no moral significance to the distinction between how many other ways of moving your body are such that the harm would have happened when and how it did, right? It doesn't matter whether if you want to put it this way, the slice of the behavior space that you're in is like little or whether it's big. One way to see that is like, imagine if some new technology were invented that would allow you to fire off a gunshot in all sorts of different ways, so that there are more ways of moving your body such that the harm would happen. Like now you can like do it with blink an eye or smile or whatever it is, right? Doesn't seem like that changes the rightness or wrongness of firing a gun the old-fashioned way. Now, Bennett's argument relies on what he puts forward, at least in the beginning, as an analysis of the concepts of doing and allowing harm. But anytime a philosopher comes up with some sort of analysis of an important concept, people are coming out with counterexamples, suspicions about the project of conceptual analysis generally, right? If you read Quine or Wittgenstein or Fodor, like a zillion other people, these kind of bigger suspicions about this very sort of project. And one way in which Bennett sort of responds to this suspicion and again, this is on page 6, is to say that, his general kind of argument might go through even if you're doing something, even if what he's offering doesn't quite reach the level of like a perfect analysis. Because what he writes is, when a purported analysis of some concept is not precisely to capture the whole truth about when the concept word, like doing or allowing, right, would be the mot juste, the question is whether the omitted aspects matter for fundamental moral theory, and sometimes they do not. So even if the analysis isn't perfect, if the thing that he puts forward initially as an analysis kind of captures everything that is even in this sort of neighborhood of maybe mattering about doing harm versus allowing harm, and there's still no morally significant sort of distinction between different ways of moving, how many different ways of moving your body, or such that the harm would happen, then that seems like the argument basically still goes through. So then I started to think, like, how could you show in a way that would be at all dialectically effective, right? That Bennett's analysis, even if it doesn't capture the entire meaning of doing harm versus allowing harm, nonetheless captures all that could, is even in the, stands a chance of being relevant about that sort of distinction. Well, I think the way you would show that is by coming up with some other kind of principle about like what kinds of things stand a chance of being morally relevant, right? And that's where that's where polarism comes in. So my thought, again, it's weird that I'm starting on page 6, but my thought is that polarism, might be a way to rule out in a principled way certain, as he puts it, omitted aspects as not mattering for fundamental moral theory. So that's how I got into that. So not like I was just sitting around in my house doing like, what kinds of isms are there that I could like slap my name onto, right? It's different. All right, so back to the first page. So I'm going to tell you what moral polarism is in kind of broad strokes, and then I'm going to tell you what it is in narrow strokes, and then I'm going to defend it, and then I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think it matters. So here's a first pass definition. So polarism is a thesis that only considerations that are fundamentally relevant to the moral quality of an action. So the only considerations that are fundamentally relevant to the moral quality of an action are those that bear on the quality of the agent's exercise of agency or on the goodness and or badness of what befalls a patient. So the intuitive glosses on this is basically like the agent, right, or agents, and the patients, like right, are the two poles, and nothing between the poles matters. So you imagine it's like an action is like a flight from agent to patients, right? Only the takeoff and the landing matter, not the stuff in the middle. That's going to get revised a little bit later, but not totally. You'll see, but that's kind of the basic idea. So what sorts of views might be opposed to polarism? Well, any view on which it matters fundamentally whether an agent's behavior caused something to befall a patient, where causation is something other than counterfactual dependence. So any view like that is opposed to polarism. So if you think causation matters, if you think the structure of a causal chain matters, if you think the manner of causation matters, whether there's a transfer of force or not, that would be opposed to polarism. Also, a view on which it matters whether an action falls into some commonsensical category, like whether it's an instance of stealing or hitting or killing or lying. We think what really matters fundamentally is whether it's an instance of one of those things. That also seems to be a view that's sort of opposed to polarism. And I'll be talking about both of these opposing views later. So polarism is not obviously opposed to any of the most well-known positions in moral philosophy. I think it's sort of consequentialist friendly, but I don't think it's not like it's just consequentialism, right? But it's not obviously opposed to any of these positions. And it's not much of a guide to action. Like, you're not going to go out in the world and be like, oh, I just learned about polarism, and then just like do stuff. Like, that's not going to guide your behavior. But I do think that once we kind of get into like, these arguments in moral theory, that actually cuts a lot of ice, right? I should say, for those of you who are watching on the YouTube channel, the handout is on my Phil Papers page. That's in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, some of you don't look at the chat. So if you don't know, if you want a link, it's in the chat. Okay. All right. So let's get into a little bit more detail about what polarism is. So the first thing to say is that I'm not describing the sort of the bearers of moral significance in terms of the metaphysics of agency or patiency. So, like, in order to kind of reasoning in accordance with polarism does not require that we be able to delineate as a matter of metaphysics when somebody's exercise of agency stops and the rest of the action takes over, right? So it's not about what counts as part of the exercise of agency versus what's not part of the exercise of agency. Or on the other hand, it's not about whether something is a part of what befalls the patient as opposed to a part of the action stuff that happens before something befalls the patient. It doesn't require you to draw those sorts of distinctions. It's about it kind of describes the bearers of moral significance in evaluative terms. It's in terms of what bears on the quality of agency or on the goodness or badness of what befalls a patient. And there's one little addendum I want to add to my characterization of polarism, which I kind of capture using the slogan, if it doesn't matter out there, it doesn't matter in here. So if, as I think is true, it's irrelevant according to polarism whether the causal path from Zebulon's exercise of agency to what befalls Yvette is direct or circuitous, then Zebulon's thoughts about whether it's direct or circuitous are likewise irrelevant. Because you might wonder whether there's some way for it to kind of get in the back door in a way, whether somebody's thoughts are about whether somebody is harming somebody else by just shooting them, or whether they're harming them using all right, raise your hand if you know what a Rube Goldberg device is. Okay, if you're what's that?
If you know, if you don't know.
If you do know, okay. Raise your hand if you're my generation. You ever play the game Mousetrap? Some of you, okay. It's yeah, okay. So that's a Rube Goldberg. It's the same group of hands. If you don't know what a Rube Goldberg device or a Mousetrap, it's imagine a very complicated device and all this crazy stuff happens or stuff. Anyway, it's a less direct route from the exercise of agency that something befalling a patient. All right, so we're still just trying to understand what polarism says, basically. But here's a kind of worry about just kind of characterizing the position. So I'm saying that there's this one thing which is some action, like Zebulon, whatever, doing A to Yvette, right? And I'm saying that the only things that bear on the rightness or wrongness of that action are things that bear on the quality of Zebulon's agency. So that's the stuff that has to do with the agent pole. And then things that bear on the goodness or badness of what befalls Yvette. So that's the patient pole. So that's the sort of idea. But you might think, well, how do we really sort of distinguish between these notions of the quality of exercise of agency and just the rightness or wrongness of the action? So if you look at the handout, there are three things I sort of three kind of goings on that I list here. One is Z's exercise of agency and doing such and such to Y. Z's doing such and such to Y. It befalling Y that Z does such and such to her. You might think, well, those are all just ways of saying the same thing, right? Isn't Z's exercise of agency, isn't that just that he did such and such, whatever the action is, to Y? And isn't what befell Y just that, or put X, but it should be Z, that Z did such and such to her? How do you how do you sort of distinguish between the sort of crucial notions, such that this theory is actually saying something that is useful at all? But I do think we have a kind of intuitive sense of how to draw these distinctions. Like when I kind of talked about the flight and the takeoff and the landing, like, you might have like most philosophers had reservations about this, and like, but like you have some intuitive sense maybe of like what's like in the kind of beginning, like the takeoff and the landing, and what's sort of in the middle. But I think we can give kind of more theoretically respectable characterizations by thinking about the roles that, on the one hand, exercise of agency plays in a plausible moral theory, and on the other hand, the role that the goodness or badness of what befalls a patient plays in a plausible moral theory. So think about, okay, what role does like the quality of the exercise of agency play, right, in a plausible moral theory? Well, you might think, well, that's kind of basically all that blameworthiness depends on. Again, this is controversial. Like you can go back and forth on this, but at least on the face of it, that like whether somebody's blameworthy for what they do just depends on the quality of their exercise of agency, not on aspects of the action other than that. So suppose I'm like backing the car out of my driveway in, what a pretty responsible way, not perfect, right? I'm not just like checking every, whatever. I don't know what the exact rules are about backing out of a driveway, but suppose I'm doing it in like the fine way, right? Well, it could turn, mostly that's going to turn out fine. Like I'll just back out and leave. But sometimes, like, a kid's going to be driving by on a bicycle and I'm going to hit the kid. Like that might happen. But it seems like in all these cases, the quality of my exercise of agency is the same, even though obviously my action, is different in the case where I hit the kid versus where I don't hit the kid. But it seems like my blameworthiness is the same in all of these cases. Like I'm not any more blameworthy if, just because by accident a kid happens to come by my path. I think on a reasonable retributivist view of punishment, it's only the quality of the exercise of agency that matters, not any other aspects of the action. And this gets discussed in the sort of criminal law literature when people try to explain why attempted murder is not punished as severely as like consummate murder. I think it's the right term. But I think, on a reasonable retributivist view of punishment, at least, what matters is like the quality of the exercise of your agency, not this stuff that comes afterwards. We're talking about the quality of somebody's character, right? If I should get so unlucky that, like, despite backing out of my driveway in like a normal, responsible way, a kid comes by or a cat or a dog gets under my wheels or something, my character is like no worse for that. I might have more trouble sleeping at night, but at least if my reason for not being able to sleep at night is that I think my character is worse, then I would think that's sort of unfounded. And things like the fittingness of remaining friends with somebody seems like it depends on. I guess friendship depends on a lot of things, but insofar as it depends on moral stuff, it should be about the quality of the exercise of your agency, not on stuff that happens after that in the kind of overall story of an action. Okay, so then if we're talking about the goodness or badness of what befalls a patient, right, and how we sort of distinguish that from the quality of the action overall. One way to do that is just by thinking about compensation or making whole. So when we think about compensatory damages in tort law, as opposed to punitive damages, right? Like compensatory damages are damages that you have to pay in order for somebody to be at the status quo ante, where they were before, right? And the goodness or badness of what befalls a patient is just how much, in the case of badness, how much worse off they were than where they were before. It doesn't depend on other aspects of other aspects of agency. So I might negligently harm Sergio such that like I have to compensate him $1,000. But then on the other hand, I might maliciously harm him such that I have to compensate him $1,000. But the measure of how much I have to compensate him is like the kind of the badness of what befalls him as a result of what I do, not whether what I do is negligent or malicious. There might be punitive damages, but if we're just thinking about compensation, it's only the goodness or badness of what befalls him, the badness of what befalls him. When we're thinking about whose life has gone better or worse, right? We're just thinking about what befalls an agent what befalls a patient. And if we're thinking about things like the fittingness of feeling sorry for somebody, what seems to matter is just the goodness or badness of what befalls them, not some overall assessment of the actions that have been done to them, right? So again, I think a lot of this stuff is controversial, but it's like, I hope it at least suffices to like give some content to these notions of the quality of exercise of agency and the goodness or badness of what befalls somebody as distinct from an overall evaluation of the action. As long as we have that distinction, it doesn't have to be like you perfectly have it, but as long as those seem to be three distinct notions, then that like seems like it's good enough to at least surmount this kind of concern about just the very articulation of the position. All right. So now, I'm going to offer some arguments for Polarism. Let me just see what time it is.
Is that?
Oh yeah. Yes, yeah.
It's on the
What's-
thing, but
Okay.
yeah.
Let's do that. Okay. Cool. So I was thinking about like, how would you argue? Like, I find Polarism. It's like, I don't know. It kind of like, fits with my way of saying things. But I was trying to think like, how do you argue for something like this? So I thought about it. I came up with two arguments. I'd be interested in kind of chatting with you all about them. So one is an argument that I'm going to call a mirroring argument, and then I've got a bunch of like debunking arguments because like in the last year or so I like tried to learn a lot about like things like causal cognition and things like that, and I wanted to use it, so that's why there's a second argument that includes that kind of shit. So here's the mirroring argument. It's a little loosey-goosey, but I don't know, it's like, I think there's something there. So the basic idea is, so we think, what is morality about? And people have different views about this, right? Like sometimes you talk to philosophers and they act like morality is about like acting well, like there's the project of action, and like you do that really well, and that's what morality is about. Sometimes people say like morality is about like how to like live together, and sometimes people say things like morality is about it's about playing a certain kind of game. There are certain sorts of rules. It's kind of quasi-legal. I guess my kind of view about these things like morality is about extending your concern for yourself outwards to others, and that moral thinking kind of addresses a matter of how to do this, right? How to take your concern for yourself and like extend it out to other people, and because there are different candidate ways of doing it that seem plausible, and that moral philosophy is about like which of those ways is like the best extension. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what mirroring is, and then say why I think it supports Polarism. So suppose you care about or you're concerned with things like having clean water to drink, or enrolling your child at a good school, or getting tickets to the Olivia Rodrigo concert. I use like a contemporary reference there. So imagine you have these kinds of concerns. So then morality is about how I should kind of extend my care or concern to these things. And my moral thoughts are correct to the extent that they appropriately reflect care and concern about these things. And my actions are right to the extent they treat these as ends in the ways that I might treat the objects of my own cares or concerns as ends. So like whether it's in my moral thought or in my behavior, I'm kind of doing right if I mirror your cares and concerns. So if it's no cost to me whatsoever, and I can do something that like helps you to enroll your child in a good school, right? That's like better than if it's no cost to me and I do something that thwarts your ambition to enroll your child in a good school, right? Or if like you show me your tickets to the Olivia Rodrigo concert and I like burn them, right? That seems like I'm not mirroring your cares or concerns. So I'm, kind of treating the stuff that that you care about sort of in the way it's the way that I would treat what I care about. And then I think is maybe kind of the core of morality. I mean, it's kind of a loose characterization, but I think that's kind of the core of morality. But there might be, and I'm not sure whether this is true, but there might be another aspect to sort of morality or moral thinking, and that involves sort of, in a way, sort of anti-mirroring people who are not mirroring your cares or concerns. So imagine like a third person thinks that you should not have clean water or be able to enroll your child at a good school, whatever, and tries to thwart these aims of yours. So this person anti-mirrors your cares or concerns. And you might think this is mirroring because like the mirror reverses thing. I don't want to get into that. It's like, it's sometimes like it doesn't, it was like, this book, The Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature by Richard Rorty. So it's like anti-mirroring, right? So that person like they're anti-mirroring your cares or concerns. And so it seems like plausibly, right, that it's good for me to anti-mirror this other person's bad cares or concerns. And why is that? Well, maybe one reason is because these things have as their objects someone else not getting what they care about or concerned with. Maybe it's because by anti-mirroring the cares or concerns of somebody who is concerned that you not get what you want, I'm thereby taking your side, and I should take your side. So if you ever read like certain things and kind of trying to justify criminal punishment, like some of Gene Hampton's work or George Fletcher's work, and they try to explain why it's good thing to punish criminals. I actually think it's kind of tough to explain why it's a good thing to punish criminals. But their explanation is that it has something to do with sort of taking the side of somebody who's been victimized, and that requires taking sides against the sort of victimizer. Right? But it might also be that anti-mirroring has no independent value. I'm saying these are like plausible ways to think about morality, but it's like I'm not sure that they're right. So here's how this bears on polarism. So in thinking that the goodness or badness of what befalls a patient matters, so like this the patient pole of everything, I'm thereby mirroring their cares or concerns. So it seems like, caring about the goodness or badness of what befalls patients is part of this mirroring that I think is the sort of essence of morality. And in thinking that the agent's exercise of agency matters, I'm thereby, if somebody has sort of bad intentions or insufficient concern for others, I'm thereby anti-mirroring their bad exercise of agency. And so it seems like if mirroring is sort of the essence of morality, that kind of lends some support to this idea that you should that the sort of agent pole matters, right? Like you should care about whether the exercise of agency is like looks good or doesn't look good, what their intentions are, what their motives are. But it seems like if what you're thinking about is like the circuitousness of a causal connection, right? So for example, do you think that it matters whether you shoot a gun at somebody or whether, or take like the kind of footbridge case. If you guys are familiar with the footbridge trolley case, well, when they do experiments and they survey people about their intuitions about these cases, they think that it really makes a difference. At least some people seem to think it makes a major difference whether you push the person off of the footbridge or whether you pull a lever that causes the person to fall through the footbridge and hit the tracks. If you think that kind of distinction matters, that it doesn't seem like in thinking so you're thereby mirroring or anti-mirroring anything. So the things like the directness or the circuitousness or whatever, force transfer or whatever, these things might matter aesthetically, but not morally. So we might think certain flights from agency to like what befalls the patient like look prettier or whatever, right? But it doesn't seem like they matter morally. There's something, I don't know, it seems almost like kind of, I don't know, inhuman, or it's like this fetishistic attachment to the kind of physical goings on, even as like they're sort of distinct from what actually happens to a person or what actually gets emitted from an agent. And so it seems like that's kind of not something that should matter if we think that like mirroring is a sort of essence of morality, because there's nothing really there to mirror, right? That's kind of like cold, inert nature that like you shouldn't really care about, except insofar as it's like instrumentally related to like somebody getting their head chopped off or whatever it is that befalls the patient. All right, so Let's talk about these debunking arguments for a second. Please, 20 more minutes or so. So I'm not really going to be able to like present these with the care that they really deserve. I mean, anytime you present debunking arguments against some position in moral philosophy, I think the natural question is always, well, why don't the same kind? Why do you stop there? Why doesn't what you're saying basically? Why aren't there similar arguments to just kind of debunk all of morality or something like that? And we can talk about that in Q&A, but I'm not going to try to talk about that here because there's just not enough time. But I'm really going to focus on two anti-polarist views that I want to debunk. One view is just one on which causation matters morally, where causation is something other than mere counterfactual dependence. And another view that I want to debunk is one on which form matters morally. What I mean by that is a view in which it matters that your action instantiates some form like killing or hitting or stealing or lying or something like that. So let's talk about the causation views first. Basically, I'm suspicious of the view that causation matters morally because I think that if you look at what causes us to attribute causation to some process, it's like the things that the things that we take into account when we attribute causation are things that I don't think fundamentally matter morally. They seem to me like fundamentally morally irrelevant. So let's think like why do we? So imagine some case where you comport yourself in some way and something happens, whether it's good or bad, and the thing that happens counterfactually depends on the way you comport yourself, right? So in some such cases, we say that the way you comported yourself caused the thing to happen. And in some cases, we say, no, it didn't cause it. It's only that the thing that happened counterfactually depended on the way you comported yourself. So what causes us to attribute causation? Well, if you look at the kind of literature on causal cognitions, there are really kinds of two stories about what we're taking into account when we go this extra step and say, oh no, there was causation here. So there's one kind of body of work that suggests that what we take into account is whether we think there was some kind of force transfer. So I mean, I recommend Philip Wolff's paper representing causation here. It's like kind of really lays the position out pretty well. The idea is that when we attribute causation, we're doing so on the basis of the fact that there was some transfer of forces, whereas there's not always such a transfer of forces in other cases of counterfactual dependence. So intuitively, like when I push somebody, I transfer force. When I shoot somebody, I transfer force. When a boulder is rolling down the hill towards Molly and I remove an obstacle to the boulder, I'm not transferring force to her, right? So that's not a case of force transfer. Intuitively, I don't transfer force when if you're underwater and you're breathing air from the scuba tank, if I cut the line that connects the scuba tank to your mouth, I'm not transferring force to you. Obviously, anytime you intervene on the world, you're transferring force to something. But the question is whether you transfer force to the thing that you could be, said to cause. Right? So there's another kind of body of work in the psychology of causal cognition, which says that we ascribe causation on the basis of what's called portability. So there's a paper by Christopher Hitchcock where he puts this pretty nicely. He says, the function of ascribing relations of actual causation is to locate dependence relations, that is counterfactual dependence relations, that are highly portable to other systems. And the portable dependence relations are the ones between variables, like in the world, such that a small intervention on an independent variable allows one to make a substantial change in the specific way one wishes on a dependent variable in a variety of relevantly similar situations, such that the relations can be said to be portable or generalizable to either situations. Kind of background idea is that like we we attribute causation, we care about causation because we care about intervention in the world. We care about it for practical purposes, right? And so there are all these kind of relations of counterfactual dependence in the world that we don't really care about because they don't correspond to any useful ways of intervening in the world. Useful in the sense that we can make a small change that doesn't require really, all that much effort, and thereby bring about what we want across a range of, situations that are similar to actuality. Right? So if you just think about two cases, one where, think about like what's required in order for a fire to light. Well, one thing that might be required is that there's somebody lights a match or does something like that. Another thing that might be required is that that there be oxygen in the room. But people typically say that lighting the match or the match lighting somehow causes the fire, whereas they'll say things like the presence of oxygen. That's not the cause of the fire. That's a mere background condition. And the theory of the psychologists who kind of think about causation in this way is that we draw this distinction because these like intervening by lighting a match is portable, right? Like, across a range of relevantly similar cases, this is an easy way to get what you want. Whereas manipulating the amount of oxygen is not generally a useful way to get what you want, right? It's like, imagine I just want to light a fire. It's not, I can't go around looking for all the places where there might be a little bit of a spark and then just blowing a lot of oxygen. I don't know how you would even do that, right? So it's kind of less useful, and so that's why we don't think about a case like that as one where there's causation. But what I want to say about all these cases is that forced transfer seems morally irrelevant, and portability seems morally irrelevant. We'll talk more about that later on, but that's the kind of the general strategy. That what's causing us to attribute causation is something that's fundamentally not significant, morally speaking. Okay, so now I want to try debunking these views on which form matters morally. And maybe these are sort of less popular. I mean, it's like there's something almost kind of, primeval or something about views that say when we go around characterizing deontology or in terms of doing and allowing or the doctrine of double effect or these kinds of fancy principles, it sounds super respectable and theoretically good. But when we characterize it in terms of we think killing and stealing and pushing are bad, it sounds kind of primitive or whatever. But I think this is actually the way a lot of people think about just kind of common sense morality. So there are certain forms of action, you don't want your actions to instantiate those forms. But I think that we kind of attribute sort of special wrongness to these forms on the basis of considerations that are, again, morally irrelevant. And that's because I think that we as it's sometimes what we chunk actions into forms on the basis of these morally irrelevant considerations, and then value gets assigned to these chunks, to these actions kind of considered as these, under these descriptions of these forms, via these evolutionary or learning processes. So, but why do we chunk? Well, I think there are kind of two explanations in the psychological literature for why we chunk. One comes from Baird and Baldwin. Basically, as they put it, a low-level skill for detecting meaningful structure in the behavior stream seems to be a prerequisite for infants' emerging sophistication in the realm of intentional understanding. So that basically the idea is, if you want a sort of explanation of why we chunk actions in the way that we do, right? For why we think in terms of A hit B or A stole from B, rather than thinking about actions in terms of A moved his arm 45 degrees to the left or something like that. Why do we kind of think about things in these ways that hitting, stealing, killing, right? It's because those ways of thinking are useful in assigning psychological states to other agents. So if I want to know whether this person I'm dealing with is somebody who I want to be around or not be around, somebody who's likely to do good things or bad things, I want to know sort of what they're like inside. And so if I think of them as somebody who hits and steals and kills, that tells me a lot. Whereas if I think, oh, this is somebody who often moves their arms swiftly to the right, that doesn't tell you that much, right? But the thought is, if that's why we sort of chunk actions in the way that we do, that doesn't seem to be like something that's morally significant. That might be useful for assigning psychological states to other people, but the fact that we chunk actions in the way that we do, and then assign value to those actions through sort of learning processes where those chunks are the things that like are valued or devalued, doesn't seem to be something that's morally significant. And maybe we chunk actions. This is the kind of more popular explanation. I'm not going to read all these quotes, but maybe we chunk them for reasons of like computational efficiency. This is like the same explanation that people give for why we chunk numbers in the way that we do, right? So you go on the internet and you get these like passcodes and they have like 6 numbers or whatever, and you sort of you can memorize that sort of 6-number chunk, right? Or it's on this 7-number chunk. And we do the same sorts of things with actions. So we think of actions in terms of A hit B, or A stole from B, or A lied to B, or whatever. And the thought is, we do this because it's more efficient to sort of encode actions this way and then assign value to the actions so encoded than it is to encode actions in terms of moving your arm 3 meters to the left, and that gets some value, and then doing something else with your leg, and that gets some value, and you kind of put them all together. That seems sort of unwieldy. But again, my question would be, why should the sorts of things to which fundamental moral significance is assigned depend on considerations of computational efficiency or implementability? That, again, you can see the sort of practical advantages of thinking about action this way. But if we're thinking about what's fundamentally morally significant, like for the purpose of not like what would make moral, or not like what's instrumentally useful as a way of thinking about action, but in terms of like what matters like by the lights of fundamental moral theory, it doesn't seem like considerations of like computational efficiency should really matter. What time do you have? I've got like 10 minutes. Okay, so now I just want to talk about some of the implications of polarism. I've already talked about the Bennett one, so that's kind of, I'll just go by that one quickly. Okay, so I'll run through these quickly. One implication of polarism is that causal structure doesn't matter. So, think of judgments like, okay, you shouldn't push the person off the footbridge, or that terrorism is ceteris paribus worse than conventional warfare. These kind of whatever canards of common sense morality. There are different explanations of that people try to give of these purported truths. But the one that Frances Cam offers is something she calls the doctrine of productive purity. And here's her statement in a 2006 paper. So if an evil cannot be at least sufficiently justified, it cannot be justified by the greater good that's necessary given our act to causally produce it. However, such an evil can be justified by the greater good whose components cause it, even if the evil is causally necessary to help sustain a greater good or its components. But again, if polarism is right, then the order of goods and evils in a causal chain doesn't matter, right? That's part of that like intermediate thing, like between the takeoff and the landing, that doesn't matter. Nor does the difference between sustaining and causing, right? That's all stuff that by the polarist slice doesn't matter. All right. As you might have also suspect, I don't think causation versus counterfactual dependence matters. So here's Molly Gardner proposes the following principle about, as part of what matters about causation and moral theory, from a 2019 paper: a harmful action that causes greater benefits can sometimes be justified by those benefits, but a harmful action that does not cause greater benefits cannot be justified by any subsequent benefits that the action itself does not cause. And what she's thinking of cases where the subsequent benefits are not benefits that are just totally unconnected from the action, but they're ones where they could be related by a counterfactual dependence relation to the action. But if polarism is right, then the distinction between counterfactual dependence and causation doesn't matter. That's kind of irrelevant by polarist lights. A question you might have, and this is kind of my favorite part of the paper, because like this is the one that required the most thought to say like the right thing and not a totally stupid thing about. So polarism, as I'm understanding it, seems to imply that causation is irrelevant. But does it also imply that counterfactual dependence is irrelevant? Because like polarism basically says, look, it's only like my first pass characterization is like, it's only like the quality of agency that matters. And then on the other hand, the goodness or badness of what befalls the patient. And so, yeah, like on the view like that, it seems like the causal path or whatever doesn't matter. But then what should it say about whether it matters whether there's any kind of relationship of counterfactual dependence between the exercise of agency and then what befalls the patient? And it's so problems seem to lurk regardless of what you say here. So suppose we say, yeah, like polarism actually does imply that counterfactual dependence is irrelevant. Well, then that just seems kind of absurd that like, if we're thinking about the rightness or wrongness of your action, it seems like it should matter how your action is like connected to other stuff that happens in the world, right? Like it doesn't like, otherwise we'd be like, oh yeah, any action that happens like in the same world as like the Holocaust is thereby bad. That seems like a very strange thing to say. But suppose we say no, suppose we say that polarism does not imply that counterfactual dependence is irrelevant. But then you think like, well, why not? If it implies that causation is irrelevant because that's like in that like middle part, like between the takeoff and the landing, well, so is counterfactual dependence is also a relation. So it seems like special pleading to be like, oh no, wait, actually counterfactual dependence really matters. But here's what I want to say about this issue. So I think counterfactual dependence matters, but it matters not because it matters sort of evaluatively, but because it matters practically. And maybe like, what the hell are you talking about? But here's how I want to try to get that idea in your heads. So you're probably familiar with the claim that ought implies can, or maybe even the claim that ought implies cannot. It's possible not to. So that you ought to do something, only if it's possible, only if you can do it. But then ought looks like it. Whether you ought to do something looks like it kind of takes into account two very different sorts of things. On the one hand, it seems to depend on things like, okay, does it help people? Does it hurt people? Whatever, right? But it also takes into account whether I, the agent, can do it. And those seem like really different sorts of things. So like if you imagine like one thing that ought depend whether you ought to do something depends on is, imagine you draw up like the pros and the cons. Like pro is like, oh, it helps this person. The con would be, oh, but it hurts this person. And the other thing might be like it produces that makes people more equal, and this other thing might be able to takes away freedom or whatever it is. And then it's like it doesn't seem like the fact that I can do it very obviously goes in like pro or con. And if I'm thinking about somebody else is doing the action, it seems like whether I'd admire them for doing it depends on the pros and cons. It doesn't seem like it depends on like whether I can do it myself. Like I wouldn't admire anybody less for doing something just because I couldn't do the action myself. That'd be pretty odd. So ought thoughts seem to be playing these two different roles. So evaluation is one of them, but then the guidance of action is the other. And so I want to say the same thing is going on here. So just as some actions are impossible, some agent pole event, patient pole event pairs are impossible, and some are necessary in the sense that the patient pole event will happen regardless of whether the agent pole event does. And so those pairs, I want to say, are practically irrelevant, just as impossible actions, and if there are any necessary actions, are practically irrelevant. But to say that a patient pole event counterfactually depends on an agent pole event is just to say that the pair is not practically irrelevant. So that's why counterfactual dependence matters to what you ought to do, not because it goes in like the pro column or the con column, but because it bears on the practicality of your thoughts. But this same kind of reasoning doesn't explain why causation as such is sort of distinct from counterfactual dependence would matter. And to think otherwise would be like thinking, imagine if you were like, okay, ought implies can. And so, if that's plausible, then maybe it's plausible on similar grounds that ought implies that you can do it with your feet, or you can do it without prosthetics. But I think that would be a very strange thing to think, right? The explanation for why it matters to what you ought to do, whether you can do it, the explanation for that doesn't seem to serve as an explanation or even kind of suggest or lend any kind of support for the claim that it matters whether you can do something without prosthetics. And I think similarly, the kind of explanation that I'd want to give for why counterfactual dependence matters, even on a polarist view, doesn't seem to suggest any kind of support for causation mattering, because the counterfactual dependence is just something that falls out of there being some kind of, like these considerations of like practical relevance and action guidance. It's not something that like falls in the pro column or the con column. Okay, I already talked about the Bennett thing, so I'm not going to say any more about that. I just want to quickly talk about a view that, I don't know if it's popular, certainly it's in the literature, and I find it interesting. It's a view it's called relationism. And if you've taken like philosophy of tort law or whatever, you've probably come across this. So relationists think that fundamental moral facts are of the form, they're relational. Like Zebulon has a duty to Yvette not to do A, or to do A or not to do A to her. And these are thought to ground duties of compensation that Zebulon has to Yvette in the event that she's injured by his not doing A, or on the other hand, by his doing A. So yeah, I feel like I want to spend like 10 more minutes on this, but I'm not. I'm just going to run through it, and if it doesn't make any sense, that's okay. So if polarism is true, that the fundamental objects of moral concern are agent and patient polar facts, and relations only matter, as I was saying before, for practical purposes. And so if that's right, then it seems like relationism is kind of not the right way to think about fundamental morality. It also seems to lend support to a system for remedying harms that's very different from the traditional system of tort law. Like, when I was in law school, like I had Jules Coleman as my whatever philosophy of tort law, and so it's philosophy of tort law class with Jules Coleman, and he was very influenced by Ernie Weinrib, who's like famous kind of philosopher of law here at U of T, and I remember Coleman sort of defending the traditional way of remedying harms, that is through tort law, by saying that morality has this, or at least the part of morality that tort law is trying to capture, has this fundamentally relational structure that's like A has a duty to B, and then if A doesn't do that duty, then A owes compensation to B for failing to do that duty. And I remember there was this other system of fixing harms that Coleman was saying is inappropriate because it doesn't seem to be supported by this allegedly fundamental like strand in morality. And this is the system that I think they have it in New Zealand, maybe they have it elsewhere too. It's a system where people pay into a pool based on their like levels of fault, like basically how bad your exercise of agency is, to put it in my terms. And then people get compensated based on their levels of suffering, as opposed to like compensation going from the tortfeasor directly to the victim. And it seemed like to me like the New Zealand system was like a lot better and fairer. And I think part of that is because I'm not a relationist, a relationalist about this aspect of morality. And I think polarism is, one way to kind of explain where relationalism is going wrong, because it's like assigning fundamental moral significance to whether to this bipolar relation, as it's sometimes called. But whereas on the polarist view, like what all that fundamentally matters in terms of like going in the pro or con column is, the quality of agency on the one hand and what befalls a patient on the other. It seems if that's all that matters, then a system like the kind of fault pool system that's used to compensate people seems in certain ways better than the traditional tort system. So anyway, that's the talk.
We're going to have our usual 5-minute break. Sorry. And then come back.